Muy buenos días. Yo soy Lila Beth, directora interina del Instituto México del Wilson Center, y es un placer para mí darles la bienvenida. Como muchos de ustedes ya saben, el Wilson Center fue creado en 1968 como un monumento al presidente estadounidense Woodrow Wilson, y es uno de los centros de pensamiento apartidistas más destacados en Estados Unidos y se dedica a desarrollar propuestas de política pública a través de investigaciones independientes y diálogos constructivos. El Instituto México es uno de 14 programas que engloba el Wilson Center y se enfoca en fortalecer la relación bilateral entre México y Estados Unidos. Cada 12 años coinciden las elecciones presidenciales en México y Estados Unidos, y los comicios de 2024 en ambos lados de la frontera determinarán en muchos sentidos el futuro de la relación bilateral. Es por ello que de cara a las elecciones históricas de México, el Instituto México lanzó una serie de seminarios virtuales sobre diversos temas electorales, y el evento de hoy se enfocará en analizar los resultados y sus implicaciones de la elección del 2 de junio. Los comicios en México fueron históricos, no solo porque fueron las elecciones más grandes en la historia del país, con más de 20,000 cargos a renovar, pero porque de los más de 59 millones de mexicanos que emitieron su voto, el casi 60%, es decir, 35 millones de ciudadanos, eligieron a Claudia Sheinbaum como la primera mujer presidenta en 200 años desde su independencia. Con el 96,21% de los votos escrutados, la candidata oficialista ganó con el 59,35% de los votos, a más de 30 puntos de distancia de Xóchitl Gálvez, la candidata presidencial de la alianza opositora entre el PRI, el PAN y el PRD, que obtiene una media del 27,28%. En tercer lugar quedó con 10,41% de los votos Jorge Álvarez Maínez, candidato presidencial de Movimiento Ciudadano. En una victoria aplastante, Claudia Sheinbaum superó la votación del presidente Andrés Manuel López Obrador, con 6 puntos por encima del 53,2% que obtuvo su predecesor en los comicios de 2018, aunque la participación ciudadana de esta contienda fue menor. De hecho, según cálculos del conteo rápido, Sheinbaum ha tenido más del doble de votos con los que Fox y Calderón ganaron la presidencia. Los resultados de la composición del Congreso están todavía sujetos a posibles cambios menores, pero todo indica que la coalición de Morena obtuvo una mayoría calificada en la Cámara de Diputados con 372 diputados y hasta el momento tiene 83 senadores, 2 escaños cortos para obtener la mayoría calificada en la Cámara Alta. Aunque tendrán que negociar con el Senado, todo indica que la presidenta electa Sheinbaum contará con el apoyo para aprobar reformas constitucionales. La coalición oficialista también ganó 7 de las 9 gubernaturas, incluyendo la jefatura de gobierno de la Ciudad de México. La coalición opositora quedó desfigurada y descalificada, una señal de que millones de ciudadanos optaron por la continuación del gobierno de la Cuarta Transformación que inició el presidente López Obrador y que Sheinbaum promete continuar al tomar el mando el próximo 1 de octubre. Si bien es cierto que la oposición prepara las impugnaciones por supuestas irregularidades en lo que ellos consideran una elección de Estado, es difícil que se pueda modificar el resultado de la contienda presidencial, la cual, como se mencionó, la ganó Claudia Sheinbaum por más de 30 puntos. Dicho esto, existe la posibilidad de que las elecciones para diputados federales, senadores y puestos locales y municipales, que fueron más reñidas, podrían ver un cambio, aunque ligero, en los resultados. Lo que sí está en discusión es la interpretación de la sobrerepresentación de la coalición oficialista en el Congreso. Los 3 partidos que integraron la coalición Sigamos Haciendo Historia contarían con cerca del 74% de los curules en la Cámara Baja, cuando solo obtuvieron el 54% de los votos, lo que significa una sobrerepresentación del 18%. En el Senado tendrían aproximadamente el 65%, cuando solo ganaron el 45,8% de los votos. El artículo 54 de la Constitución especifica el límite de 8 puntos de sobrerepresentación por cada partido político. Sin embargo, la figura de la coalición no se plantea. Entonces, esto será un punto sin duda importante para discusión en la Sala Superior del Tribunal Electoral. El nuevo Congreso tomará posesión el 1 de septiembre, casi un mes antes de que el presidente López Obrador deje su cargo, debido a que el mandatario mexicano ya presentó 20 reformas constitucionales y legales ante el Congreso, entre ellas una reforma judicial para que los jueces, magistrados y ministros del Poder Judicial sean electos por voto popular, al igual que una reforma para traspasar la Guardia Nacional a la Sedena, una reforma electoral que contempla reducciones del gasto destinado a campañas y partidos políticos, así como eliminar las candidaturas plurinominales, entre otras. Y es muy probable que intente el presidente López Obrador aprobar muchas de ellas antes del 1 de octubre. Estas elecciones fueron históricas y sus implicaciones marcarán el rumbo del país durante los próximos 6 años. Con la concentración del poder en la presidencia, con la mayoría calificada en la Cámara Baja y una mayoría importante del partido gobernante en el Senado, y con la posibilidad de un poder judicial debilitado, el futuro de la democracia en México podría estar en riesgo. La discusión de hoy tiene como objetivo abordar muchos de los temas que acabo de mencionar, y para ello tenemos un grupo de expertos de lujo que nos compartirán sus opiniones y análisis sobre los resultados de esta elección histórica en México. Por cuestiones de tiempo, no compartiré las biografías completas de los panelistas, pero las pueden consultar en la página web del Instituto México. Le doy la bienvenida a Jorge Buendía, Global Fellow del Wilson Center y director de Buendía y Márquez. También nos acompaña Isabela Cota, periodista de investigación galardonada y autora que escribe sobre negocios, finanzas, política y derechos de las mujeres en Estados Unidos, Europa y América Latina. Viridiana Ríos es una académica mexicana, especialista en análisis de política pública con datos, escribe en El País y Milenio y es instructora en Harvard Summer School. Amy Glover, CEO y cofundadora de Agile, empresa que se dedica a los asuntos políticos y comunicación estratégica. Anteriormente fue directora de México de McClarty Associates. La estructura del evento será la siguiente. Iniciaremos el primer bloque con comentarios de los distintos panelistas sobre las elecciones en México. En el segundo bloque sostendremos una conversación entre los expertos sobre lo que podemos esperar durante el sexenio de Claudia Sheinbaum. Concluiremos con una sesión de preguntas y respuestas con la audiencia. Aprovecho la oportunidad para recordarle a nuestra audiencia que contamos con traducción simultánea. En la esquina derecha de la parte inferior de su pantalla deben de ver una imagen de un globo. Al presionar el globo podrán escoger el idioma de su preferencia. De igual forma, nuestra audiencia podrá enviar preguntas a nuestros ponentes por medio de nuestra cuenta X, @Mexico Institute, o a nuestro correo electrónico mexico@wilsoncenter.org. Si les es más fácil, también pueden enviar sus preguntas directamente en la caja de chat de este Zoom. Pero antes de empezar, quiero aprovechar esta oportunidad para agradecerles a nuestros panelistas por tomarse el tiempo de compartir su visión y conocimiento con nuestra audiencia. Entonces, ahora sí iniciamos con el seminario virtual y empiezo contigo, Jorge. Justo antes de iniciar este seminario virtual estábamos platicando que las encuestas en grandes rasgos pues tenían razón. Claudia Sheinbaum ganó con más de 30 puntos, aunque tú decías que tal vez superaron, ¿no?, las expectativas que tenían los encuestadores. ¿Qué nos puedes contar del análisis de los resultados que viste este pasado 2 de junio en México? Estás en mute, Jorge.
Gracias. Eh, Efectivamente, fue una elección que nunca estuvo cerrada. Realmente desde las primeras mediciones, una vez que se conocieron los diferentes candidatos, estamos hablando de septiembre, digamos, son las fechas en que tanto Xóchitl Gálvez como Claudia Sheinbaum se dieron a conocer. Eh, las primeras mediciones ya daban una ventaja de 2-1 de Sheinbaum sobre Xóchitl Gálvez, ¿no? Ya hasta enero que se da a conocer que Maínez es el candidato del Movimiento Ciudadano, también hablaban de una amplia ventaja. Entonces, lo que hubo fue una guerra de narrativas. Ciertamente, había dos factores que influían en la percepción de cuán competida pudiera ser esta elección. Por un lado, y esto creo que fue lo más importante, los resultados de la elección de 2021, que mostraban prácticamente a partes iguales la coalición oficial versus la coalición opositora. Sin embargo, las condiciones de 2021 no fueron las mismas o no son las mismas que 2024. En 2021 estábamos saliendo de la pandemia, por un lado, y en segundo lugar, y creo que esto es lo más importante, en 2021 Morena solo tenía 7 gobernadores. La oposición tenía muchos gobernadores y los gobernadores son líderes políticos naturales. Sin embargo, para esta elección en 2024, Morena ya tenía 23 gobernadores, incluyendo Estado de México, es decir, la oposición ya no tenía a estos líderes territoriales y esto se reflejó en buena medida en el resultado de la elección. Creo que otro aspecto que también hay que destacar del actual proceso es México no es un país polarizado. Digo, estos resultados nos los muestran de manera muy, muy clara. Ciertamente puede haber un segmento polarizado. Y me atrevería a decir que en realidad, si el país no está polarizado, la Ciudad de México sí. ¿En qué sentido? Hay divisiones regionales, hay divisiones socioeconómicas en términos de preferencias electorales. Y es importante poner esto de la polarización. Por ejemplo, pensemos en 2006. En 2006, además de lo cerrado de la elección, tuvimos el norte del país que se inclinó abrumadoramente por Felipe Calderón y el sur y la zona metropolitana de la Ciudad de México que se inclinó por Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Además, a nivel socioeconómico había claras diferencias entre las personas de mayor nivel socioeconómico que apoyaron a Calderón y las de menor nivel socioeconómico que apoyaron a López Obrador en ese momento. Esto es realmente, digamos, si me permite la expresión, así es como se ve la polarización. Hoy día México no está viviendo una polarización de ese tipo, aunque la Ciudad de México, pues de sobremanera sí le está reflejando. Eh, Otra reflexión es las candidaturas expresa a la presidencia no funcionan. ¿Y a qué me refiero con candidaturas express? Si vemos las candidaturas exitosas a la presidencia cuando hubo alternancia, es decir, cuando gana la oposición, se trató de candidatos que empezaron el camino a la presidencia desde años atrás. Fox deja la gubernatura de Guanajuato, Peña Nieto empezó a trabajar en su candidatura presidencial prácticamente desde el día uno de que asumió la gubernatura. López Obrador, bueno, esta es la tercera vez que lo intenta. Y aquí realmente, y esta es la lección para la oposición, Xóchitl Gálvez un año antes todavía coqueteaba con la Ciudad de México. Álvarez Maínez fue designado 2 meses antes de que iniciaron las campañas. Así no puedes tener realmente mucho éxito en una contienda presidencial. Sheinbaum, en cambio, desde 2022, pues ya había iniciado digamos, los trabajos para posicionarse a nivel nacional. Y también tuvimos durante la campaña efectos importantes, aunque no en la dirección que se esperaban. Ustedes recordarán que se habló mucho de que en marzo las cosas podían cambiar. Incluso hubo quienes hablaban de la primavera de marzo, ¿no? La primavera mexicana, que ahí es cuando cambian las cosas y las contiendas se vuelven más competidas. Se esperaba que se cerrara la brecha entre Sheinbaum y Xochitl Gálvez y en realidad ocurrió lo contrario. El primer debate y los eventos alrededor de ellos fueron muy negativos para Xochitl Gálvez. Ahí aumentaron mucho sus negativos y la brecha entre ella y Sheinbaum se abrió. Un último punto, y ya después podemos entrar a abundar en cosas eh, detalladas, es relacionado con esto. Xochitl Gálvez no fue una candidata atractiva para los votantes de oposición. Y esto se ve de manera mucho más clara cuando comparamos el voto que PAN, PRI, PRD obtuvieron para diputados versus el voto que obtuvo Xochitl Gálvez. Hubo mayor voto para PAN, PRI, PRD a nivel legislativo cuando son marcas muy desacreditadas, digamos, con muchos negativos. Xochitl no logró ni siquiera cohesionar esa base. Probablemente el hecho de presentarse como candidata ciudadana pues no fue muy atractivo para los votantes de PAN, PRI y PRD. Y por último, también hacer referencia, porque va a surgir, y sería bueno hablarlo, vimos la resurrección de una idea que yo creía que ya estaba muerta, una idea zombie, por llamarla así, que es que a la oposición le va mejor cuando hay mayor participación. Incluso Xochitl Gálvez dijo que con 63% de los votos ella iba a ganar. Y esta es una idea que venimos escuchando desde los años 90, cuando se presagiaba la derrota del PRI si votaba más del 70%. Eh, es una mala idea, pero sirve mucho para las narrativas, ¿no? Se ha hablado mucho de esto en el caso de la Ciudad de México. Eh, Y, por ejemplo, en el caso de la Ciudad de México, la participación de 2021 a 2024 pasó de 52 a 69%, es decir, aumentó 17 puntos porcentuales, pero el voto por Morena aumentó más de 10 puntos, Morena y sus aliados. Entonces, es una mala idea, probablemente lo sigamos escuchando porque se presta mucho a las narrativas de campaña, pero simplemente no hay evidencia que la sustente. Y con eso concluyo esta primera etapa.
Gracias, Jorge. Viri, voy contigo. ¿Cuáles fueron tus primeras impresiones de los resultados de la elección en México? ¿Cuál es tu visión de que México por fin escogió o eligió a su primera mujer presidenta?
Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Me escuchan? Ok, bueno, perfecto. Muchísimas gracias por la invitación. Esperen, porque los dejé de escuchar, los dejé de ver un minuto. Muchísimas gracias por la invitación. Yo me había preparado en inglés, entonces voy a hacer mis comentarios en Spanglish, meaning I'm gonna use English as much as I can, and then if I cannot say something, I'm gonna say it in Spanish. So let me start by saying the three things that I want to say today. One is I want to talk about the extent of Sheinbaum's victory. Second, I want to talk about the status of Mexico's democracy. And then finally, I want to talk about what to expect from Claudia, right, from Sheinbaum. So first, Morena victory. Wendy already said a lot of things, so let me just be very brief. The extent of Sheinbaum's victory is truly unprecedented, right? So she won among all demographics, gender, age, income, education, and profession, right? There are a few exceptions. For example, she didn't win among businessmen, and she didn't win among college-educated voters. However, those two groups in Mexico represent 16% of Mexico's population, and among those groups, she tied with Galvez, right? So it was not that Galvez won by far. So what I say when I talk to investors, what I say to them is that if they don't know anybody who voted for Morena, it's not because of their education or their income. It is because of their friends. And that's a problem, you know, particularly in Washington, which is one of the very few cities in the world where Mexicans prefer voting for PAN instead of Morena. And we observe that also in this election, right? So I'm going to stop here because basically the numbers show that Claudia won big, and I don't want to stop that. I don't want to stop on this more. So let me move to my second point, right, which is the status of Mexico's democracy. And here, I think we have to be very honest and say that it is impossible to say that Mexico's democracy is entirely safe, right? Like at the end of the day, Sheinbaum has a supermajority, and she campaigned on reforms that would concentrate power on her electoral coalitions, such as popular elections to fill the Supreme Court and the Electoral Institute. Lila already said a ton about this, right? Yet, I feel optimistic about the future of Mexico's democracy, and let me explain you why, right? So two basic points, right? The first one is Sheinbaum's personality and political leadership, right? So Sheinbaum has consistently affirmed in many forums that she's committed to democratic values. And that's something important for politicians, for her base, and for understanding what is happening in Mexico. She said this in her victory speech, and unlike AMLO, she does not have a populist profile, right? She is more disciplined, she is less confrontational, and she has a much better relationship with the press. She also has announced important policies to build bridges to groups that were affected by AMLO's policies. For example, the upper middle classes, the businessmen, artists, academics, the energy industry, right? So shame-bound is not AMLO, and that's very important for Washington to know. Second point, institutional and political features, right? So shame-bound is gonna face, how to say it? I would say very different circumstances from AMLO, right? She will face a larger probability of legislative fracture, meaning her coalition may fracture. She's gonna face internal party fragmentation with larger likelihood. Because she's a female, all research shows that she's also gonna face larger probability of popularity backlashes, right? Because in sexist societies, as Mexico is, and this is proved with data, female politicians tend to be evaluated harshly. And she will also face some institutional constraints that are quite strong, such as the mandatory revocatory referendum, which allows voters to basically kick her out of office in 3 years. And when I say kick her out of office, first is literal, and second is not a majority, it's only with 20 million people, right? Like if 20 million people vote for her to go, she's gonna go. Now, consider that Mexico has 100 million voters, right? So it's this is a very strong picture, right? It's a very strong institutional constraint. That's how I call it. Now, among all the institutional and political features that I discussed so far, let me concentrate specifically on two that I consider particularly important and that I think haven't been discussed enough on the media and among analysts. The first one is what I was telling to you about the instability of Morena's legislative coalition, right? And this is important because this is an institutional feature, again, of Mexico that I don't think it's very well known. But the point is that to achieve a supermajority, Morena has to create a strategy to distribute districts among its coalition members such that Morena could maximize the seats that it was going to get under the rules of the proportional representation system of Mexico, right? So this meant that Morena had to distribute control among not only Morena itself, but also the two other parties that integrate Morena's coalition, which is PT, the Workers' Party, and Verde, right, which is the Greens Party, the Green Party. So this means that the supermajority of Morena depends largely, entirely on the loyalty of the Green Party and the PT. And the loyalty of the Green Party is particularly questionable, as we all know, right? Like the Green Party was allied with PAN until 2018, with PRI until 2012, and it's a party that is known for frequently changing coalitions to serve its interests. Now, Partido Verde, thanks to this strategy, the Green Party now became the second most important force in Mexico, which means that now the Green Party is going to have incentives to also operate on their own. And it's not very clear that the Green Party is going to remain loyal to Morena. So that's a very important institutional feature, and we should, like, pay attention to how that coalition behaves in the medium term. Now, second point. Second of the important institutional features points that I was describing, which is Morena's internal fractures. The probability of Morena fracturing is going to increase. And we are already observing that, right? So the problem is that Morena has brought many politicians from all around the political spectrum to become candidates of Morena. And they do that in order to become more competitive, right? And these new politicians, they tend to be less disciplined. And also they tend to cause more internal splits because Morena members, Morena militants feel excluded, right? So they feel that we are already observing some splits from Morena loyalists that feel betrayed by the party because the party is empowering other local politicians. We saw protests in Chihuahua, in Guanajuato, in Puebla, in Estado de Mexico, in many places, right? Some Morena activists, for example, in Tlaxcala, they even openly campaign for the opposition, right? And others, I was talking to others in Durango, and they said that they wanted to create an Obradorista party, the AMLO party, right? Like, think about like a Pernice party, right? Like the AMLO party. So all this is to say that AMLO used to be the glue that kept Morena together, right? And with his departure, it's unclear to us, analysts and academics, whether the force of Morena will remain entirely cohesive. And what we are observing is that it may not be, right? So among other things that make me optimistic about Mexican democracy, one is that support for INE and the Supreme Court have not diminished; they have increased. Even in a moment where both institutes have been in attacked, I would say. Mexicans are pretty committed to keep their democracy. We have observed protests in favor of these institutions. The mandate of Claudia, this is very important. The mandate of Claudia is not destroying democracy. The mandate of Claudia is improving the living conditions of people. And her success on improving the living conditions of Mexicans depends entirely on Mexican democracy being solid. So she has incentives to make democracy solid. She has incentives to create a middle-class country. She has incentives to remain on an export-oriented economy, because all of these features are going to make the economy more resilient, democracy more resilient, and at the end of the day, that's going to be good for her base, which is the working classes of Mexico and the poor. So let me just stop here. Me detengo ahora, Lila, y sigamos platicando más.
Gracias, Viri. Yo creo que tocaste sobre varios temas fundamentales, ¿no? Creo que tienes toda la razón que la composición interna de Morena no va a ser igual con Claudia Sheinbaum que con Andrés Manuel López Obrador, y eso puede cambiar mucho la dinámica, no solamente para el presidente, sino también, como bien lo mencionaste, en el Congreso. Y creo que tu aportación en cuanto al apoyo que hay, que ha demostrado la ciudadanía mexicana a favor del INE y ojalá también del Poder Judicial, va a ser fundamental. Si es que, lo que, por ejemplo, a mí no me preocupa lo de Claudia Sheinbaum, ¿no? Cuando entre el 1 de octubre, pero ese mes antes de que entre Claudia, pues ahí podría entrar muchas de estas reformas del presidente López Obrador. Pero Isabela, voy contigo. Tus primeras impresiones, sé que tú escribes mucho también sobre temas de género. ¿Qué tan importante es este momento para las mujeres mexicanas de que llegó la primer mujer líder, ¿no? Mandataria al país, sin olvidar que México todavía tiene una epidemia de violencia de género y de feminicidios en el país? Muchas gracias por estar aquí, Isabela.
Buenos días. Yo también había preparado mis remarks en inglés, entonces igual me voy a pasar en inglés.
Adelante en inglés.
Okay, bueno. These elections have felt to me a bit like deja vu, and to me, they truly show us the extent to both inequality and injustice in Mexico, and I'll get to that in a minute. First, I'm going to talk quickly about the representation side. So Morena won the highest number of governorships, 8 in total. This means that they're going to go from governing 23 to 24 states. Notably, a total of 13 governorships will be held by women. This is the most in the country's history, and it's really derivative of the 2019 constitutional reform, which required political parties to present equal number of male and female candidates for all offices. In fact, Mexico City's mayor who won, she was one who was appointed, even though she had lost the internal election, she was appointed because they needed to comply with this gender parity. And now she's going to be the mayor, even though not the first female mayor. Of course, Sheinbaum was the first female mayor. So in terms of representation, it's not just the president, which could create a giant cultural push, because let's remember, elections are not just about politics. They're also about culture and about social issues. And I think that on that side of the female representation, And unlike many people in my sphere, analysts, etc., I'm actually quite optimistic and quite happy about it. I mean, think about it. We have a female central bank governor. We have a female president of the Electoral Institute. We have I mean, there's just representation everywhere, and that pushes Mexico culturally, which I'm very happy about. Now, let's talk a little bit about Congress. The ruling party, Morena, and its allies won 83 senatorial seats. This is not set in stone. We're not going to know the true final results of this election in terms of the senators until August. So this could be adjusted by a few, but this leaves them 1 or 2 steps away from a supermajority that they would need for constitutional reforms. I found Viri's remarks about how the coalition is kind of like dislocated and perhaps not the most cohesive, very interesting. And I also think that we have a very weak PRI, and this presents an opportunity for Morena as well to negotiate with parties outside of their alliance if they need so, because these parties have lost a lot of power. And I think one of the messages of the election is that people truly dislike opposition parties that have been in power for such a long time. And I think this could be an opportunity for Morena if they choose to go after it. In addition to the Senate, of course, Morena is estimated to have won 365 seats. In the lower house, this is by far the supermajority. So I think that even Morena was very surprised by these results. Now, I think the reason why the markets reacted so, I don't want to say violently, but with such strength in the last couple of days to the results in Congress in particular, is because this now presents a kind of division, a potential shift between what Morena, the party, wants and what the president wants. Because as Viri rightly points out, this has been the party of AMLO so far, and now we don't even know how AMLO is going to play a role anymore. And so what happens, and these are all speculations that are going through investors' minds, what happens if Sheinbaum actually is not going after democracy, but the party is? And how is she going to negotiate? And is she going to be the de facto leader of the party, which has been the case in Mexico once a president comes into power, but it's unclear this time around. We are going through a bunch of firsts in this election, and this is all going to be playing out throughout the first few months, I think, of next year, maybe. So we have to be patient. Now, I call this a deja vu because I find it very interesting that I'm having the same conversations with the same people that I had in 2018 when AMLO won. This part of Mexican society that are very surprised. How could they have voted Morena on such a landslide victory? How are they not worried about dismantling democracy? And I think 2 things that we have to reflect upon as Mexicans and even people outside of Mexico are that AMLO had lost his majority in the midterms, and that was attributed partly to his offensive and his fight that he picked with the Electoral Institute. I don't think a lot of people reacted positively to that. I think the Electoral Institute is still an institution seen as a net positive for Mexico. It was a game changer for him to go after the justice system. As you know, the strongest part of his agenda is to reform the justice system in a way that judges and magistrates are elected by a popular vote. This scares a lot of people. This is, of course, entering a territory of challenging democracy that is perhaps new to this generation of Mexicans. But what many Mexicans don't understand is that the security situation in Mexico has a lot to do with the justice system. We think in Mexico as the police or the military or the Guardia Nacional as ones responsible for its security situation in Mexico. But the truth is that they do one part of the work. And then when you actually arrest criminals and try to prosecute them, this falls into the justice system, which has been proven at times to be very corrupt. And I think that there's a reflection to be made here, an analysis that should be made about if Mexicans actually support this plan to reform the justice system because they themselves have been victim of corruption within the justice system. This is something that is very important, especially for those who say that they're worried about democracy. Finally, I'll just end with this one reflection. Mexico stands out among other countries, not just peers, but I'm talking about most countries in the world this year, with this giant election year going on in the world, because the ultra-right is not really a thing. And I think that counts for something. That could have changed in this election. And we didn't even see it. The ultra-right has no room, has no space, has no, it's not even a thing. And I think that, I don't want to say that we should take that as a victory necessarily, even though I'm not ultra-right, but I do think that it's an interesting thing that we need to think about when we study the results of this election and what they mean in the coming years, and how in the end, democracy means different things for different people. And so if we're going to talk about how this is threatening democracy, the results of this election are threatening democracy, we need to talk about that as well. These are my remarks, and thank you again for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Isabella. I think I'm going to shift to English for the time being, because I think there's like an overall consensus that English is the language, but if anybody prefers to speak in Spanish, we do have simultaneous translation available. I think, Isabella, some of the issues that you raised were extremely interesting. The fact that the PRI is extremely weakened and could also serve as a potential ally, especially I would say in the Senate, where there's still two places short to have that supermajority. That can definitely be happening. And just to quickly reflect on the ultra-right sort of disappearing, having no room in Mexican politics, I think this has a lot to do as well with the fact that political ideologies don't really mean a lot in Mexico. It's true though. If you look at the principios básicos, right? The basic principles of a lot of these political parties, they say there are something in paper, and in practice tend to be completely different. And so I think it does say something about, what political ideologies mean in Mexico, if they actually, practice what they preach. But, just a small reflection as well on what you just said. Amy, so glad to have you here. What is your take? I mean, I think the big sort of question surrounding Claudia Sheinbaum's 6-year term is what role, if any, AMLO is going to continue to play, and how strictly is she going to abide by the second level of the fourth transformation of the current president? Would love to get your thoughts on that, and of course, your general impressions of the election.
Great. Thank you, Lila. I'll speak in English. I came prepared to speak in Spanish. Sí soy mexicana y es muy importante para mí subrayar ese punto. I think, it's been a super interesting points that everyone has made. I think part of what has created some worry on the part of the private sector and the reaction we saw in the markets has to do precisely with whether or not there will be contrapesos. And I think that is what's on most people's mind, and the concern over democracy. But also, I think it goes a little bit further. Mexico does have a lot of major challenges, both in terms of poverty, the security situation. Mexico has not gotten on board with the energy transition, which is both important for the country's competitiveness and for climate change globally. And López Obrador has been a leader who has repeatedly insulted a large swath of the population and has threatened the press on various occasions. And Claudia Sheinbaum calls him her mentor over the last 30 years and says, that he has done a great job and that she is 100% beholden to him. Let's hope that's not the case. I also am cautiously optimistic that she will be her own woman. I think she's very intelligent. I think she's very well prepared. I'm very excited to have a female president and very proud that lo logramos antes que Estados Unidos. Woohoo. And it's not just, as others have pointed out, a female president. We have women, you know, there's a woman who is now going to run Mexico City, which is the largest city in the country, 9 million people, or 20 million if you want to call, you know, include the Zona Metropolitana. So I think what creates a little bit of unease is precisely this uncertainty. And what do markets and investors hate? Uncertainty. When you analyze if you're going to put your money somewhere, you think of two principal things. You think of what are the risks and what are the opportunities, and where does that balance come out? Mexico is extremely attractive, and Mexico is a large country. It's strategically positioned. It's got huge advantages, particularly with geography, because we are a bridge between North America and Latin America. We're strategically placed to receive investment and commerce from Asia, from Europe. So Mexico has huge advantages. We have the USMCA or TMEC, which provides a framework, which also provides a certain level of uncertainty, which will be reviewed in 2026, as we all know, and the World Cup will be in 2026, which is also very interesting, and you know, will be a focus for North America. The workforce in Mexico is considered very attractive, and not because of low wages, because of productivity, because of a culture of hard work, and what is really now, I mean, Mexico is a manufacturing powerhouse. So these are the opportunities, right, that people look at and you say, wow, I mean, I want to be in Mexico. What are some of the risks? The risks are precisely as we've laid out here. And as Viri mentions, there will be this revocación de mandato, potentially, you know, a discussion in 3 years regarding the presidency of Claudia Sheinbaum, something that was not relevant before, and something that was precisely Morena or López Obrador that they put in place. We're just before a lot of uncertainty, because there are a lot of firsts. Morena is not a party that's been around even for a long time, and there's a lot of divisions within Morena. So the question is, who's going to come out on top, and who's really going to both have the back of Claudia Sheinbaum and have the influence in terms of pushing policy forward? What are some of the other risks for investors that are interested in increasing their investments in Mexico? Because what we've seen to date, yes, is a lot of foreign direct investment, which is reinvestment. Last year, only 8% of the foreign investment inflows were new. So this flow of what we call nearshoring has yet to arrive. And frankly, Mexico has no clear strategy in that regard. You know, what is Mexico's value proposition? It needs to be explained and communicated much more clearly. Energy is critical for basically everything we do. Mexico needs more energy in terms of quantity, but Mexico also needs cleaner energy. Right now, Mexico's energy sector is focused on oil and gas. And that has been something that has been a clear policy of López Obrador, to invest billions of dollars in an oil refinery in the 21st century, when everyone else is looking towards clean energy. Fortunately, Claudia Sheinbaum is a climate scientist. She has a lot of expertise. Let's hope. I mean, she's the first one who's I've heard from Morena talk about energy transition. I mean, to my knowledge, has never come out of the lips of President López Obrador. So that's a good sign, but we've got to hit the ground running in that regard if we're going to be competitive. Water is a big problem. The bureaucracy is a big problem. The judicial system is a big problem, because Mexico is highly bureaucratic, and also very centralized. If, as Jorge says, Mexico City is divided, maybe not the rest of the country. Well, Mexico City is the largest urban population in the country and is extremely influential because Mexico's political system is very centralized. So anyway, I'll leave it there, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Amy. So we've received a lot of questions from the audience, and I know we still have a little time left. So I'll ask everyone to provide perhaps a briefer, a bit more summarized of comments so that we can get through the second round, and then we can dive into the audience's questions because I do want to get to them. Jorge, I wanted to ask you, I mean, Amy touched upon really important aspects of Claudia Sheinbaum's political reform, what she hopes to do that's different from AMLO, but I think one cannot ignore the fact that, I mean, she has a long trajectory in public service. She's a scientist. She's a environmental engineer. She's a very talented woman, right? And she did receive 60% of the vote, more votes than AMLO did in 2018. Now, that said, and this is true throughout Mexico's, history, she was handpicked by AMLO, a person that, truly believes has initiated the fourth transformation of Mexico. And I feel like it would be a little bit naive to think that he handpicked a successor that won't continue, not on everything, but on most things of his government. Again, we could be cautiously optimistic, cautiously hopeful, but where do you think Claudia Sheinbaum going? Like, where are the real differences? And what is she actually going to build on from AMLO's platform? Because let's not forget, this was, yes, an election for Claudia Sheinbaum, but many believe it was also a referendum on AMLO's government. So would be really excited to hear about your thoughts and happy to have you participate in English or in Spanish.
Okay. Let's look at what Claudia Sheinbaum did while in the Mexico City government. She was surrounded not by apparatchiks, by Morena filots, but rather by a lot of professional people that have not even a trajectory in partisan politics. So I think that she's going to be, at least regarding the administration of the country, she's going to be different than López Obrador. I don't think that she's going to follow this 90% loyalty, 10% capacity, rather the other way around. And that's what everybody that has worked with her says. Secondly, I think that she's going to be a data-driven president. She's going to be much more careful with the public monies than López Obrador. And I don't think that if it had been her decision, she could have invested in Dos Bocas or even the Tren Maya. So she's going to be more careful. So I think that in terms of the administration of the country, it's going to be, she's going to have a very different profile. This being said, she's also a Morena politician. She grew up in that movement. She represents some of the values. I think that she's really committed to fighting inequality. But I think that, for instance, her experience in the Mexico City government, and for instance, all the debate about the Formula One event, that she wanted to have it canceled, and then she was given the reasons why it was a very bad idea, and now she has finally seeing what the benefits for the city are. I think she's going to try to find more win-win agreements with the private sector. She also had a very good experience with the private sector in Mexico City about how to tackle the COVID crisis. I mean, they created a hospital that was financed by the private sector in order to face this health crisis. So it's going to be different. we can also have a hint of how she relates to the what we can call the radical sector of Morena when the nomination of Morena's candidate for Mexico City took place. I mean, she wanted Omar Garcia Harfuch to be the next mayor of Mexico City, and she was strongly opposed by the radical faction within Morena. And I think that has been the main clear division between her and what she wants and where she wants the country to be taken to, and what we could call the apparatchiki of Morena. So I think there are going to be very important differences in that regard. What should we be looking as key signs about what's to come with her, like the canary in the coal mine? I think that the first thing to look at is who are going to be the Morena's parliamentary leaders for the next 3 years. I think it's very important to see if we are going to see some Morena oligarchs, politicians taking control of the leadership in both chambers, or we will see some new faces more better aligned to Claudia Sheinbaum. That's one thing. We will have to wait and see what happens and what it's called the September window. And then we have the nomination of the Supreme Court Justice at the end of the year. That's another very important sign of where she's going to go. So I think those are very important. And I want to finish mentioning that both choice and political identity are not the same thing. I mean, 60% of the people vote for Sheinbaum because they thought that she was a better candidate than Xochitl or Maynes. But not 60% of Mexicans are Morenistas. Actually, about almost half of the Mexican population are nonpartisan independents, and they are very volatile in terms of electoral preferences. In fact, we can see, or we can argue that the changes that we've seen from 21 to 24 are an example of this volatility. So we will see in the next few months probably a honeymoon period for Claudia, sort of realignment in terms of people who have a very good opinion about Morena or even identifies Morenistas. But this is something that it may last just a few months. It has happened in the past, and we have to wait and see. And the big question is, who's going to be the face of the Mexican opposition? The opposition has to reinvent itself. And one very important difference regarding other alternations or other moments is that in previous periods of government, the Mexico City office was in the hands of the opposition. And that was the main face of the opposition in Mexico, whether Marcelo Ebrard or López Obrador. That changed in 2018. Now, the challenge for the opposition is to find a face or some faces that are going to be the light that guides all voters that are dissatisfied with Morena and Sheinbaum.
Thank you,
Lila,
Jorge.
Can
Yes.
I quickly,
Of course,
so quickly
yes.
push back on
Yes.
something? I want to push back on the track record, on Sheinbaum's track record, because our memory is so short. When she first came to power in Mexico City, she outright canceled, for example, a contract that took a lot of political capital for the previous administration to sign that would have turned a waste into a type of energy, for example. I mean, she has a PhD in energy engineering, and somehow she wasn't on board with this contract. There were justifications that there was corruption behind it, and that's why, but then she didn't actually push for an investigation or try to bring anybody to justice for that corruption. We also forget forget that under her administration, there was a pilot program implemented to give people ivermectin to treat COVID. And then they tried to publish those results in a well-renowned science journal that rejected the results. This is all under her administration. We also forget that during the first 1.5 years of her administration, there was 0 construction permits for Mexico City because she needed to send the message to the cartel inmobiliario, the people selling and buying property in a corrupt way, that, you know, there was going to be no more corruption. Not only were there scandal after scandal of corruption in the later part of their administration, which means she didn't solve the corruption problem, she was not a pragmatist when it comes to this. I think what I see is a lot of complacency from markets and from investors because they ascribe qualities to her that they wish she had, but they don't really know. The very big question is, who is she? She had a very short, tight mold that she had to fit into to get this nomination within Morena. There was nothing that she could do to show the side of her that is even slightly different from AMLO, because that was simply not going to work for the 4T. And so we're only going to get to truly know her once she's president. And I think that's quite bad for a democracy and a country as big as Mexico. That's it.
And one where there's a supermajority in Congress and could be a lack of separation of powers. I mean, like you said, I think we won't truly know until she's in office, and that's just simply for the reason that until then, AMLO's still going to take most of the attention. I'm going to ask Viri and Amy if you can answer questions that I've received from audience members, and they all relate in one shape or another. How will the electoral outcome affect the U.S. presidential election and the future of U.S.-Mexico relations, right? Viri, you talk about all these issues at Harvard Summer School, so would love to get your take on sort of where are the areas of opportunity, of potential challenges between both nations, and this is obviously going to depend in large part who wins the elections in the United States in November. But happy to hear your thoughts, Viri.
Right. So let me just jump on the question of whether Sheinbaum is AMLO, because I'm very optimistic that she's not. And I think that many of the instances where she argued that it was corruption were later proved to be corruption. Like the cartel inmobiliario is true. Like there are people in prison because of that corruption scandal. And if corruption kept happening, it was not because of the city regulations, it was because of the borough regulation of Benito Juárez, right? And many other boroughs. So it's not only that one, but many others, right? And I do think we need to understand that she is going to be tougher on her negotiations with the private industry, because, for example, many of the contracts that were previously done and accepted had conditions that she thought could be improved. One example of that is the bicycles of the city, Ecobici, right? Ecobici, she improved the contract, she got a better deal for the state, and Ecobici remained, you know? So if she found some contracts that were not sufficiently good for the states in her terms or in the terms of her team, that, by the way, was a very professional team, as Buendia said, I think that she is allowed to move forward and to change how the state and private industry work together. But okay, so then setting that aside, I think, and let me just I want to emphasize something, which is the mandate of Claudia on the ballot was not the mandate of following Obradorismo or continuing a negative transformation for Mexico. Her mandate was much more simple. And I'm not talking about what the media say. I'm talking about like when you actually talk to people and when you actually see the polls, right? And you see why people voted for her. The reason why people voted for her is because they want improvements in their lives, and because AMLO has proved effectively has proved to be effective on increasing wages through regulation and also on increasing public expenditure. So her mandate is really reducing inequality and improving the lives of the working class Mexicans. And Claudia is a smart person. So Claudia knows that if her goal is to reduce inequality and poverty, then she cannot just do things that are incompatible with creating stability in the macro economy of Mexico. Destroying institutions is creating instability. And that's going to go against her mandate. And I think that Claudia is much more rational and much less radical than AMLO, right? And we can find and discuss many other instances where she has shown that. Now in terms of the relationship, just very quickly, I think there are basically three topics, right? Violence, immigration, and also trade. I think that in terms of trade, we should not think that there is going to be a major change in the sense that both the US and the Mexican economy work together. They work very well. They are very integrated. So I don't see Claudia affecting in any form the export-oriented economy. If anything, she has incentives again to promote these industries, because those are the industries that create the best jobs in Mexico, right? So if her mandate is to create good jobs, as I think it is, then she's going to promote trade. She's going to, just like keep moving in the direction of trying to further integrate Mexico with the US. In terms of immigration, I do think that's going to be a huge problem for Claudia. And that's not because of her policies, but because of what is happening today in America, which is that basically there is a bipartisan consensus now that the country should not accept more immigrants, or should reduce the amount of immigrants that the country is going to accept. And the way the US is dealing with immigration flows is basically by transferring the problem to Mexico. So now Mexico, for the first time, is observing camps of like immigrants, not only at the border, as it used to be the case since many years ago, but also in Mexico City and like in other important cities. And this is going to be a problem for her, because the Mexican economy is not necessarily as effective providing opportunities for immigrant workers as the US economy could be if the US wanted to improve its immigration policies, right? So because the Mexican economy is weaker, then it's unclear whether immigrants are going to actually be capable of finding jobs. And it's also unclear what's the impact, or if there could be even a negative impact of having immigrants, joining the labor market. Then finally, in terms of violence, I think militarization is going to continue. The reason being that there is no other police currently on place to perform the duties that the Guardia Nacional is performing. And in that sense, I think she's also going to be very pragmatic. Now, one interesting thing is that when Sheinbaum was the mayor of Mexico City, she did not militarize the police. She actually created a very, very effective civilian police. And the head of that police, Omar Harfuch, seems like it's still to be determined, but he will probably be part of her cabinet. And this is not a person that comes from the military. This is a person that comes from like the civil servant that knows about investigations, knows about research, knows about creating civilian police. So I feel that by having Omar Harfuch on her team, I think she's sending a signal that at least there could be some chance that at the local level, not at the federal level, but at the local level, they may push for the creation of more effective local policies in some specific cities, in some large urban concentrations in Mexico.
Thank you, Viri. I'm going to continue with the questions. Amy, I'll go over to you. If we can be succinct as possible so that we can get through some of these, because we do have about 24 questions that are pending. There are a lot of questions regarding what a Trump-Sheinbaum relationship would look like. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then I will go over to Isabella and Jorge to talk about sort of what the fiscal policies of Claudia Sheinbaum look like, and also if she's going to push a tax reform. A lot of the policies and projects that she lays out in her political platform require a lot of money and a lot of resources. So we'll start off with you, Amy, and then we'll move on to Isabella and Jorge.
Ok, perfecto. Yo voy a cambiar al español nada más para confundir a todos, pero vi algunas quejas en el chat, entonces vamos a realmente hacerlo bilingüe. Primero, nada más quería regresar al punto de Claudia Sheinbaum, si ella será distinta a lo que hemos visto con López Obrador, y creo que esperamos, creo que todos los mexicanos, es mayor eficacia en el gobierno. Creo que la idea de generar bienestar para todos los mexicanos es fundamental. Dicho eso, en los últimos 6 años hemos invertido en una refinería, un Tren Maya y un aeropuerto que no está utilizado al máximo, en vez de invertir en salud y educación, que para mí son los temas más importantes para construir ese bienestar y empoderar a los mexicanos a que tengan un mejor futuro. Los anuncios recientes de que Rogelio Ramírez de la O se queda en Hacienda creo que es buena señal. Es un economista muy bueno. Creo que algo muy positivo que ha mantenido México en los últimos 25 años tras diferentes gobiernos es la estabilidad macroeconómica. Coincido que hay poca ideología, lo cual es bueno, y en ese sentido creo que el enfoque tiene que ser, ok, eficacia. ¿Querían gobernar? Tienen toda la enchilada, suerte, ¿no? Y lo más inteligente sería extender la mano y abrir diálogo. Creo que una cosa que ha frustrado mucho es que no ha habido suficiente diálogo. Estoy de acuerdo con Viri, el Estado tiene que negociar bien con el sector privado. No, francamente, yo estoy en contra de de bajar impuestos para atraer inversión. No lo necesitamos. Tenemos suficientes ventajas corporativas. Y podemos establecer esas reglas del juego, pero depende del Estado hacer eso. Y con respecto a la relación con Estados Unidos, creo que en México hemos querido minimizar la revisión de 2026. Creo que sí va a ser más complejo de lo que quisiéramos, porque simplemente abre una discusión de cuáles son los pain points que hay que considerar. Será más difícil si es Trump, sin duda, sobre todo en cuanto a narrativas, porque sí va a ser mucho más violento en sus expresiones hacia México. Pero con Biden o con Trump, ¿cuál va a ser el tema central en esa discusión en 2026? Estados Unidos no quiere tanta presencia de China en México. La pregunta para México es, ¿cuál es tu política vis-a-vis China? No tenemos una política. Necesitamos una estrategia y lo necesitamos urgentemente.
Gracias, Amy. Isabella, I'll go with you. We got a question about what are the incentives of the Green Party and even the PRI under your analysis to break from Morena? Isn't it perhaps a business more than a political party, and the money they frantically look for is on the government's budget? Makes little sense for them to break their profited coalition, don't you think? So I think this is building off of what Viri said about the Partido Verde perhaps not being as loyal, or the fact that Morena absolutely needs the Green Party in order to have its supermajority. But I guess this question goes, to the contrary. What are the incentives for them to break from the governing party?
I'll start by talking a little bit about the fiscal pressures, which has a lot to do with this. So let's just briefly touch on Sheinbaum's fiscal plans. Okay, so the good thing about Sheinbaum's fiscal plans is that she doesn't have any of these giant infrastructure projects. Like, she doesn't have a giant refinery or a tourist train off of Yucatan. So all of these resources that have been truly like a black hole under AMLO's administration, with the overcosts and how they have cost so much more than they were initially supposed to cost. We don't have that concern with Sheinbaum. She has been very conservative about her spending so far as plans go. She announced an investment of about $13.6 billion in energy, which she says is going to be mostly renewable energy. To be honest, in a country as big as Mexico, with an energy matrix like Mexico, 13.6 billion is not that much. But so she's being conservative, right? The other thing she has said is that there's going to be no need to pass fiscal reform and increase taxes for two reasons. One is she's going to grow the economy, therefore that will increase revenue naturally. If you grow GDP, then you have a high percentage that will come into in the public finances, which is, I think it's not wishful thinking, but kind of ambiguous. It's very easy to promise that, very difficult to execute. The other thing she said is that she's going to digitize customs in a way that saves so much money that it's going to provide a windfall for Mexican public finances. That is yet to be seen, or how long that's going to take. But there's a very interesting question that has come with the supermajority, which is, if Sheinbaum is so smart and she's so pragmatic, will she make the same mistake AMLO made during the first term of his presidency? AMLO waited to pass a bunch of reforms, including some of the most controversial energy reforms, for the second part of his administration. I don't know why, but it didn't work out quite well because he had lost the majority in the midterms. Sheinbaum has a supermajority now. The country needs fiscal reform. We need a progressive fiscal reform. So now would be the moment to do it. Do it in the first 3 years of your administration. She's already promised all of these empresarios, all these corporations, that she won't. But it would be a missed opportunity not to do it. So that's a big thing that we need to look out for. If indeed, as people say, she's so pragmatic and smart, then she's going to do it in the first 3 years of her administration. Now, what does this mean for the political parties? I agree with Viri that the Partido Verde and the Partido del Trabajo, the PT to a lesser extent, they are opportunist parties. They simply look out after their own interests, and therefore, they might not be willing to play ball with Morena, or, they might this time around ask for more in return, or, get more, what's the word? Just become harder to negotiate now. At the same time, this is new for Partido Verde because it's officially become, it's on its way to becoming the second political force in Mexico. I mean, they've basically, they've taken over where the PAN used to be in such a solid, stable position. And that has huge implications. I think that the Partido Verde is now going to have to start strategizing in a different way. They are a different player. I don't know exactly if they would have incentives to break off from Morena, but I do think that they have incentives to take this moment, capitalize it, and grow it, for them to become a larger political party on their own and not always be seen as a kind of like annex to the ruling party. So I hope this answers the question.
Thank you, Isabella. Jorge, there's a question for you specifically about whether voters really want, or if you've tracked whether voters actually, when they gave the vote, whether they were thinking essentially that they don't want any checks and balances on the presidency, or was it just the fact that they voted and didn't really realize that they were voting overall, right, for Morena? But it does play into, I think, and I'll just add to this question about AMLO's Plan C. So did that strategy really work, or was it just people were voting, kind of just for the president without thinking what that meant for legislative balance and governorships in the country?
Creo que en general el argumento de que el votante madisoniano que busca tener la presidencia en un partido y el Congreso en manos de otro partido es un argumento muy sofisticado que pocos mexicanos comparten. De hecho, lo preguntábamos en las encuestas y alrededor, si no me falla la memoria, 60%, casi 2/3 partes, nos decían que preferían que el partido del presidente también tuviera mayoría en la Cámara de Diputados, ¿no? Sé que fue un argumento y creo que es parte, digamos, del poco o del relativo fracaso que tuvo Xóchitl Gálvez, que mucho de su propuesta política se centró precisamente en la regresión autoritaria, ¿no? Desde la defensa del INE hasta que se podían perder libertades de todo tipo, ¿no? Ese argumento por llamarlo así, de índole política o de defender la democracia, no prosperó tanto o tiene arraigo solamente en ciertos segmentos de la población y quizá más en la Ciudad de México, eh, pero en contraparte, digamos, con lo que la gente, los beneficios que recibía no solamente de programas sociales, sino incluso del mood que había en la economía, pues es muy diferente. Por ejemplo, si comparamos, el índice de confianza del consumidor está en su mejor momento desde hace varios años, eh, mucho mejor que el que había en la elección intermedia del 21, pero si comparamos los números previo a la elección de 2018, en junio de 2018 el índice era de 36 puntos, ahora está en 47 puntos. Entonces, la parte económica o beneficios sociales, todo esto que podemos englobar en ingreso disponible, por llamarlo así, pues es algo que pesó mucho más que el discurso de generar contrapesos al gobierno o al futuro gobierno.
Gracias, Jorge. Viri, I'm going to say this in English because the question is in English. What are Sheinbaum's views on the centralization of healthcare and access to quality healthcare, and how is she going to push forward with AMLO's social programs, if any?
Bueno, voy a hablar en español también para diversificar. Los programas sociales que AMLO implementó son enormemente populares y nadie espera que cambien. Lo que va a suceder es que se van a mantener y yo pienso que ella los va a volver más efectivos. Uno de los grandes problemas que tuvo López Obrador con sus programas sociales es que debido a su falta de estrategia y capacidad de implementación, no logró con esos programas sociales llegar a los más pobres. El 10% más pobre en específico, que son personas que viven en lugares alejados, en la sierra, en las zonas rurales, no obtuvieron suficientes apoyos por parte del gobierno. Claudia tiene una estrategia y ha declarado que tiene una estrategia para mejorar su capacidad para llegar a esos lugares, su capacidad para llegar a los más pobres. Y también tiene una estrategia para otorgar mayores programas sociales a las mujeres, particularmente la pensión. Su plan es esta pequeña pensión, que en realidad es un cash transfer, que actualmente se otorga a las personas de 65 años y más. Ella quiere hacer que el cash transfer llegue a las mujeres que tienen 60 y más. Es decir, se mantiene para los hombres en 65 y más, pero para las mujeres bajaría a 60 y más. Y me dijiste, Lila, una otra pregunta, ¿no?
Sí, sobre la salud pública, el acceso a medicinas.
Correcto.
Sí, exacto.
Bueno, yo creo que la salud pública va a continuar centralizada y no lo veo necesariamente como un problema, porque el Seguro Popular sí tenía grandísimos problemas de corrupción. De hecho, yo hice una investigación sobre dónde existían las mayores irregularidades del gasto público en 2018, antes de que llegara Peña Nieto, antes de que llegara López Obrador al poder. Y el Seguro Popular sistemáticamente era un lugar en donde los gobernadores tomaban ese recurso y lo utilizaban en otras cosas. Y sí tenemos en México un problema mayor de capacidad, de profesionalismo en los gobiernos locales. Los gobiernos estatales y locales son menos profesionales, tienden a tener más problemas de corrupción y en general son menos efectivos. Entonces yo no veo mal que el sistema de salud se descentralice. Me parece que el problema del sistema de salud actual no es ese. El problema son dos cosas. Uno es que no tiene suficientes recursos. México gasta en puntos del PIB más o menos lo que gasta África subsahariana. Es decir, nuestro gasto en salud debería ser más o menos del doble para poder satisfacer las necesidades mínimas de un país como México. Y el segundo problema es un problema de implementación, en donde con la erradicación del seguro popular y con la creación de un sistema de salud universal, hubo muchas ineficiencias a lo largo del cambio. Y yo creo que López Obrador probó ser poco competente para resolver esas ineficiencias. Y esperemos que Claudia las resuelva. Pero el sistema de salud universal que hoy tiene México es más ambicioso y es una mejor política que el sistema del seguro popular, que era simplemente un seguro mayormente privado para resolver un número limitado de enfermedades. Es decir, lo que hoy tenemos en México, la aspiración del gobierno actual es mejor. Y si lo logra implementar, va a tener un mejor resultado en términos de salud que lo que se tenía anteriormente. La pregunta es si lo va a lograr.
Gracias, Viri. Vamos a hacer ya las palabras de cierre. Cada uno, si puede, 2, 3 minutos máximo para que le demos la oportunidad a todos de hablar. Si quieres, Amy, empezamos contigo.
Perfecto, pues muchas gracias. Creo que esta conversación da para como 8 horas porque hay 1000 enfoques. Un indicio que podemos ver también en cuanto a si esta nueva administración de Claudia Sheinbaum vaya a ser diferente es la actitud hacia la sociedad civil como un actor legítimo y los organismos independientes como el INAI. La transparencia es fundamental para una democracia y esperamos que se respete las reglas establecidas en ese sentido y para muchos otros organismos también. Creo que el meollo del asunto es la eficacia. Creo que todos queremos que le vaya bien a México, que haya menos pobreza. El sistema de salud está muy fracturado ahorita. Requiere justamente más inversión, como menciona Viri, pero la pregunta es, ok, ¿vamos a asignar ese 6% que necesitamos, sí o no? Porque hoy en día tenemos un sistema de salud universal teórico, no es real. Porque hay gente con enfermedades graves que no se atienden. Entonces, mi esperanza es que Claudia Sheinbaum tenga éxito. No me encanta tener que basar mi deseo en ese sentido en la fe. Quisiera entender mejor y voy a estar muy atenta a lo que vemos en los próximos días, semanas, meses, porque sí, en efecto, hay muchas dudas, no sabemos a ciencia cierta lo que va a suceder. Espero que el nuevo gobierno invita a todos a la mesa a platicar, incluyendo al sector privado. El sector privado es un jugador legítimo y esencial para que tengamos éxito. Y creo que todos somos mexicanos y se debería respetar y sumar. Eso es mi esperanza y tengo ganas de ayudar a construir a un mejor futuro en ese sentido. Gracias.
Gracias, Amy. Isabella, your closing remarks?
Sí, de español de vuelta. Bueno, vi que muchas preguntas se quedaron sin contestar y solamente quiero aprovechar para decir, compren mi libro porque las van a poder responder y les voy a decir por qué. El momento que estamos viviendo ahora de transición, hay muchos paralelismos con lo que vimos con López Obrador. López Obrador subió al poder prometiendo cosas muy parecidas a las de Sheinbaum, incluyendo el tema de las energías renovables, que luego cambió de opinión. Entonces, nuestra memoria es muy corta y los sexenios son muy largos. Prepárense bien para lo que vienen. Compren mi libro, se los recomiendo mucho. Ahora, por último, yo soy mexicana y la verdad es que estos últimos días han sido como emocionalmente intensos, y veo que mucha gente está muy preocupada por el tema del plan C y por el tema de las instituciones democráticas y de las instituciones autónomas, y yo creo que esas preocupaciones son legítimas. Que nos digan que Claudia Sheinbaum no es AMLO está muy bien, pero no lo sabemos con certeza, y la realidad es que ella va a llegar al poder. a lo que les toca a la sociedad civil es luchar por los derechos democráticos. Y si realmente les preocupan las instituciones democráticas y autónomas, van a tener que salir a luchar por ella. La democracia se defiende, nadie en ningún país del mundo se la garantiza nada más de gratis. La democracia es un ejercicio constante y eso le quiero dejar a los mexicanos. Y por último, voy a tomar la victoria feminista. No me importa lo que digan. Pessimism is not going to rob me of my joy, porque yo soy de las mujeres que sale a marchar a la calle 2 veces al año, siempre. Yo soy de las mujeres que financia de las organizaciones feministas. Yo he expuesto a la ultraderecha en América Latina por sus manipulaciones y mentiras en torno a los derechos reproductivos. Y esta es una victoria de las feministas también. Y por eso estoy no solo agradecida, sino también muy contenta. Muchísimas gracias.
Pues me sumo como una fiel feminista del movimiento también, Isabela. Muchas gracias. Jorge.
Brevemente, como en cualquier otro país, el futuro de la democracia depende de la competencia electoral. Sin competencia electoral no hay democracia. Y creo que pues estamos en una encrucijada o en un momento crítico. ¿Por qué? Por la debilidad de la oposición. O sea, realmente PAN, PRI, bueno, PRD ya está, pues seguramente perderá el registro, pero con oposiciones tan débiles, realmente, podríamos estar esperando pues varios años o por lo menos otro gobierno más de Morena, donde toda la apuesta de la oposición es que haya un fracaso de Morena en el gobierno para que les toque el voto de castigo. Entonces, ahí hay un gran reto para la oposición que se tiene que reinventar. La primera pregunta crucial es qué va a pasar con la alianza de PAN y PRI. ¿Se mantendrá en el legislativo o se fraccionará? Y evidentemente con los niveles de votación que tienen, pues en las siguientes elecciones pues van a arrasar con ellos. Porque no hay que olvidar que lamentablemente en México nuestras instituciones o nuestras leyes electorales lo que hacen es eh, beneficiar a los ganadores. No solo recibes mayor dinero público en manera proporcional a tus votos, lo que beneficia a los partidos más grandes, sino que también el tiempo en radio y televisión corresponde con tu porcentaje de votos. Entonces, una legislación que favorece al partido ganador. Esa va a ser las condiciones en que la oposición tendrá que competir en los próximos años y tendrá que reinventarse, encontrar nuevas caras. Seguramente MC pues será un nuevo elemento, no tiene tantos votos, pero sin duda, y aquí es otra consecuencia de esta elección, había muchas esperanzas en las nuevas caras de Movimiento Ciudadano como Luis Donaldo Colosio, y pues resulta que el electorado los castigó, ¿no? Ni siquiera ganó su elección Luis Donaldo Colosio. Entonces, pues es el gran reto que hay, las caras de la oposición, quiénes van a ser, porque como decía yo, en última instancia, la suerte de nuestra democracia depende de la competencia electoral.
Gracias, Jorge. Cerramos contigo, Viri.
Gracias, Lila. Me gustaría hacer una breve reflexión sobre la demanda por populismo que existe en México. Y es que la elección nos demostró que esta demanda es muy grande y nos demostró también que la única forma de reducir la demanda por populismo en México no es crear instituciones que excluyan a los mandatos populares de las masas enojadas. La forma de resolverlo es resolver por los temas por los cuales las masas están enojadas. México transitó a la democracia con la expectativa, México transitó a la democracia en el año 2000 con la expectativa de que la transición democrática iba a mejorar las vidas de los mexicanos. Y la realidad es que no sucedió o sucedió muy poco. Lo que vimos de 2000 a 2018 fue un incremento enorme en la desigualdad, fue una pobreza que se redujo, pero muy poco, y fue una exclusión tan grande de la base trabajadora. Que pues nos convirtió en lo que México es hoy, que es uno de los países más desiguales del mundo. En la medida en la cual las instituciones democráticas no atiendan las demandas de los trabajadores y de las clases medias y bajas mexicanas, no vamos a poder mantener una democracia sólida en México. Entonces, la discusión más fundamental para un país como Estados Unidos, me parece que no debe ser una cuestión puramente institucional, es decir, cómo creamos instituciones de contrapeso en México. La discusión debe ser más profunda, debe ser cómo creamos un México incluyente, un México menos desigual, un México en donde los trabajadores tengan una vida justa, porque solo así se va a mantener estabilidad en México y solo así se va a mantener también una reducción de la migración.
Muchísimas gracias, Viri. No tengo palabras suficientes para agradecerle a todos ustedes por haber participado y compartir su conocimiento con nuestra audiencia. Jorge Buendía, Amy Glover, Isabela Cota, Viri Ríos, siempre es un honor escucharlos. Gracias de nuevo por acompañarnos esta mañana tarde. Y por parte del Instituto México, seguiremos monitoreando el periodo de transición de la presidencia de Andrés Manuel López Obrador a la de Claudia Sheinbaum el próximo 1 de octubre y estaremos compartiendo publicaciones, eventos y seminarios virtuales que sostendremos en las próximas semanas. A nombre del Instituto México del Wilson Center, les agradezco de nuevo a nuestros panelistas y a todos los que nos acompañaron del día de hoy de manera virtual. Muchas gracias y muy buenas tardes a todos. Gracias.